In ancient times, deep within the Himalayan mountains, there existed a precious knowledge accessible to only a few. It was an understanding that went beyond the mere workings of the mind. It was the key to true emotional freedom. The masters would say that our emotions are like clouds in the sky, some dark and stormy, others light and serene. Yet, just as the sky remains unchanged, regardless of the clouds passing through it, our true nature remains calm and unshaken beneath our emotions. This is the story of how a simple merchant discovered this ancient wisdom, forever altering the way he perceived his own emotions. In a small village at the foot of the mountains lived a merchant carrying an inner storm. His days were filled with negotiations, but his nights were tormented by a restlessness he couldn't name. Anger bubbled within him like boiling water, and anxiety consumed him like invisible flames. Every failed deal, every disapproving glance from a customer, every coin lost in a bad transaction fed an inner volcano that threatened to erupt at any moment. One particularly difficult morning, after losing an important deal, the merchant realized he couldn't go on like this. His clenched fists and heavy breathing were signs that something needed to change. It was then that he heard about an old master who lived in a temple atop the mountain, renowned for teaching the art of mastering emotions. The climb to the temple was arduous. Each step was burdened by years of unresolved emotions. When he finally reached the temple gates, he was exhausted, not just from the climb, but from the emotional weight he carried. The temple was simple, yet the air seemed different, charged with a serenity he had never experienced before. The master greeted him in silence, his eyes reflecting a profound understanding beyond words. Instead of offering immediate advice, the master poured tea for the merchant and invited him to sit in a small garden. The silence was unsettling for the merchant, accustomed to the constant noise of the marketplace and his restless mind. After what felt like an eternity, the master finally spoke. "You came here to learn how to control your emotions, but first, you must learn to recognize them." He placed a blank sheet of paper before the merchant. "Your emotions are like this blank sheet. Before we write anything on it, we must first know it exists." In the days that followed, the master taught the merchant an ancient practice. Whenever an emotion arose, whether anger, fear, anxiety, or even joy, he was to first acknowledge it, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "Ah, there you are again, anger," he would say to himself, without trying to change or judge what he felt. The merchant discovered that this simple act of recognition created a small space between himself and his emotions. For the first time, he could see his emotions as waves in the ocean, rather than being swept away by them. When anger arose during a tough negotiation, he could now pause and say, "I am feeling anger right now." This simple recognition often prevented the emotion from completely overwhelming him. One morning, while practicing the observation of his emotions in the temple garden, the merchant experienced a moment of deep understanding. A flock of birds flew overhead, and he realized that his emotions were like those birds, coming and going without requiring him to hold on to them. The anger that once felt so solid and permanent now revealed itself to be as fleeting as clouds in the sky. The master, observing his student's gradual transformation, shared a final teaching on the recognition of emotions. Just as a doctor cannot treat an illness without first identifying it, we cannot transform our emotions without first recognizing them clearly. Recognition is the first step to freedom. Sitting beneath an ancient tree in the temple garden, the merchant realized he was beginning to develop a new relationship with his emotions. He was no longer their slave, but neither did he suppress or deny them. It was as if he had discovered a new pair of eyes, capable of seeing his emotions with clarity and compassion. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the merchant watched the changing colors, understanding that just as the sky embraced every shade of dusk, he too could embrace all his emotions. In that moment of profound acceptance, the master appeared once more, bringing with him a new teaching that would further deepen the merchant's understanding of the nature of emotions. Oh. The master silently gestured for the merchant to follow him. As night began to fall over the temple, they walked along a narrow path winding through the mountain. The sound of flowing water grew louder until they reached the banks of a majestic river cutting through the mountain. The full moon illuminated the waters, creating a spectacle of light and shadow on the moving surface. The master sat on a large rock by the river and motioned for the merchant to join him. For hours, they remained silent, simply observing the ceaseless flow of the water. When the first ray of sunlight touched the river's surface, the master finally spoke. "See how the water is never the same. At every moment, new water passes before your eyes. Your emotions are just like this." The merchant observed closely, realizing how impossible it was to hold on to any specific part of the river. Every wave he tried to focus on had already passed. The master picked up a small twig and tossed it into the water. "Watch how this twig is carried," he said. "Now, imagine that each emotion you feel is like this twig. Sometimes it's carried swiftly by the current. Other times, it gets caught in a whirlpool. But eventually, it always moves on." Throughout the day, the master and the merchant stayed by the river. They watched how the sun changed the appearance of the water, how shadows danced on its surface, and how the river sometimes appeared calm and other times restless. The merchant began to notice how his own emotional states shifted throughout the day. The anxiety of the morning gave way to the peace of midday, which in turn became a gentle melancholy by evening. Many suffer, the master explained, because they believe their difficult emotions will last forever. When they're sad, they think the sadness will never end. When they're angry, they think the anger is permanent. But observe the river. Even in its most turbulent moments, the water eventually calms. The merchant recalled all the times he had been consumed by anger in his dealings, convinced that the intense feeling would never subside. Now, sitting by the river, he began to understand the transient nature of emotions. In the afternoon, a storm approached. The once calm river became agitated, its waters darkened, and the waves grew violent. The master remained still, and the merchant, following his example, continued to observe. "See how the river accepts the storm," said the master. "It does not resist the change. It simply incorporates it into its flow." As the rain poured down, the merchant realized that even the most intense emotions were like that storm. No matter how powerful, they would eventually pass. The understanding struck him like lightning. It wasn't necessary to fight his emotions or force them to disappear. Like the river, he could allow them to flow naturally. When the storm passed, the river gradually returned to its earlier calm. The master pointed to the riverbank where small puddles had formed. "Look at these puddles. Some people are like them. They trap their emotions, refusing to let them flow. And just as these puddles will eventually stagnate, bottled-up emotions can become harmful." The merchant thought of all the times he had bottled up his anger, letting it build until it erupted. He understood now that, like the river, his emotions needed to be recognized and allowed to pass naturally. By nightfall, as the first stars reflected on the water surface, the master shared one final teaching about the transient nature of emotions. Just as this river is always moving, even though it looks like the same river every day, you too are constantly changing. The person who was angry yesterday is not exactly the same as the one sitting here today. The master's words resonated deeply within the merchant, who continued watching the unending movement of the water. The moon was now high in the sky, its reflection dancing on the river and creating ever-changing patterns. Then the master rose slowly, signaling that it was time to learn a new lesson about the nature of his emotions. The master guided the merchant back to the temple along a moonlit path. However, instead of returning to their quarters, they headed to the temple kitchen. The aroma of herbs lingered in the air as the master lit a small lamp. With deliberately slow movements, he began preparing tea, his hands moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. "Watch," the master said, pouring hot water over the tea leaves. Between the moment the water touched the leaves and the first aroma that filled the air, there was a pause, a moment of absolute silence. "This is the space between," the master explained. "Just as there is a moment between water touching the leaves and tea being formed, there is a space between each event in your life and your reaction to it." The merchant watched closely as the master continued preparing the tea. Every movement was precise, mindful. "Tomorrow," the master said, "we will go down to the village for an important lesson. But tonight, I want you to notice every sensation that arises as we drink this tea." As they sipped the tea in silence, the merchant became aware of how each sip created a sequence of sensations. The warmth of the cup in his hands, the aroma reaching his nose, the taste spreading across his tongue, the sensation of the warm liquid flowing down his throat. There was a subtle space between each of these sensations, a nearly imperceptible moment of pause. The following morning, before the sun had risen, the master and the merchant began their descent to the village. The market was already bustling when they arrived, with vendors setting up their stalls and buyers beginning to browse. The familiar environment made the merchant's heart race. This was the scene of so many of his emotional outbursts in the past. "Today," the master said, "you will practice finding the space between what happens and how you react." He had barely finished speaking when a young man hurried by, bumping into the merchant and causing him to drop the basket he was carrying. The merchant felt the familiar heat of anger rising in his chest, but this time, something was different. He noticed the exact moment when the emotion began to emerge. "This is the space," the master whispered. "Breathe into it." The merchant took a deep breath, observing how the sensation of anger rippled through him. To his surprise, he realized there was indeed a small gap between the moment of the bump and the surge of anger, a space where he could choose how to respond. Throughout the day, the master guided the merchant through various situations in the market. In each instance that would normally provoke an immediate reaction, a vendor trying to cheat him, someone cutting in line, a difficult negotiation, the merchant practiced finding that precious space between the stimulus and his response. "It's like a dance," the master explained as they watched the market's movements. "Between the music beginning and your body moving, there is a moment of choice. Your emotions are the music, your actions are the dance, but you are the dancer who chooses the steps." As the day went on, the merchant began to notice something extraordinary. The more he practiced finding that space, the more it seemed to expand. What once felt like a microscopic gap between event and reaction now felt like a vast field of possibilities. By late afternoon, sitting in the shade of a tree in the marketplace square, the master shared one final teaching about this space. Some people live their lives like leaves in the wind, reacting automatically to every breeze that passes. Others discover the power of the pause, the sacred moment between the wind blowing and the leaf moving. The merchant reflected on how many times in his life he had reacted instantly, without even realizing he had a choice. Now he understood that every moment of pause was an opportunity for liberation, a chance to choose a different response. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the now quieter market, the merchant realized that something fundamental had shifted within him. It wasn't that his emotions had disappeared. They were as vivid as ever, but now he could see them arising with a new clarity, as if watching waves forming on the horizon before they reached the shore. The master rose slowly, his eyes fixed on a group of people approaching the square. "Now," he said, "you are ready to learn about something even deeper that resides within the space you have discovered." The group approaching was led by a man the merchant immediately recognized, It was the thief who, months earlier, had stolen a significant amount of his goods. The merchant felt his body tense, but this time, in the space between recognition and reaction, something different occurred. The master gently placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Observe not just your emotions, but also the story behind the other's eyes." The thief also recognized the merchant, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Instead of looking away or fleeing, the man remained where he was. It was then that the merchant noticed something he had never seen before, the deep exhaustion in the thief's eyes, the worn-out clothes, and the way he shielded an elderly woman who could barely stand upright with his body. "Come closer," the master said, not to the merchant but to the group. To everyone's surprise, the thief and the elderly woman slowly approached. The master invited them to sit under the shade of the tree. "Share your story with us," he said gently. The story that unfolded was unlike anything the merchant had imagined. The man wasn't merely a thief. He was a desperate son caring for his gravely ill mother. Every coin he managed to earn went toward medicine and food. The theft had been his last resort after watching his mother weaken day after day. As he listened, the merchant felt something unusual stirring in his heart. The anger that had once burned began to transform into something else, a profound understanding of the other's pain. For the first time, he could see beyond the thief's actions to the suffering person behind them. "Compassion," the master explained, "is like clean water being poured into a cup of muddy water. The more compassion you add, the clearer the water becomes." He then pulled a small bundle of medicinal herbs from his robes and offered it to the elderly woman, explaining how to prepare them. The merchant observed the interaction with fascination. The master wasn't just teaching compassion, he was demonstrating it in action. There was no judgment in his gestures, only a loving presence that seemed to envelop everyone. "Often," the master continued, "our negative emotions arise because we only see the surface of situations. It's like looking at a lake and seeing only your reflection, unaware of the life teeming beneath its depths." As the afternoon went on, the merchant found himself sharing his own story, his struggles, fears, and inner battles. To his surprise, the thief listened with the same compassionate attention he had received moments earlier. "Do you see," the master said, "how compassion is contagious? When you open your heart to understand another's suffering, something magical happens. Your own suffering begins to dissolve." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the merchant made a decision that even surprised himself. He took out a few coins from his pouch, not as charity, but as a gesture of understanding and support. "For the medicine," he said simply. The thief, with tears in his eyes, accepted the gift with a deep bow. "True compassion," the master explained as they watched the group walk away, "is not just a pleasant feeling. It is a transformative force that has the power to heal both the giver and the receiver." The merchant realized something fundamental had shifted within him. The anger he once carried hadn't simply disappeared. It had been transformed into understanding. Where he had once seen only a thief, he now saw a fellow human being struggling with his own hardships. Night had fallen over the marketplace, and stars were beginning to dot the sky. The master lit a small lamp, its soft glow creating a warm circle of light around them. "Tomorrow," the master said, his eyes reflecting the lamplight, "you will learn how this compassion you've discovered today can grow even deeper through a greater understanding of the nature of attachment." The merchant nodded, feeling that each lesson was not merely a teaching but an opening to a new dimension of understanding of himself and others. The following morning before sunrise, the master led the merchant to a small room in the temple that he had never seen before. The space was filled with objects covered by white cloths. The master lit a few candles, and the flickering light danced on the walls, casting mysterious shadows. "Today," the master said, "you will learn about the nature of attachment and how it relates to your emotions." With a gentle motion, he removed one of the claws. revealing an old, ornate mirror. The merchant saw his reflection in the tarnished surface, slightly distorted by time. "What do you see?" the master asked. The merchant began to describe his own image, but the master gently interrupted him. "Do not tell me what your eyes see. Tell me what your heart sees when you look at yourself." And the merchant fell silent for a moment, realizing how his reflection brought forth a flurry of emotions and judgments. He saw his status as a trader, his reputation, his possessions, all the things he had clung to over the years to define who he was. The master then uncovered another cloth, revealing a small collection of gold coins. The merchant's eyes lit up instantly at the sight of the precious metal. "Observe your reaction," the master said. "See how your body responds to the mere sight of gold. This is the power of attachment." Over the next few hours, the master uncovered one object after another: an ancient scroll, a jade necklace, a royal robe. Each item elicited a different reaction in the merchant: desire, admiration, envy, pride. Every emotion that arises, the master explained, is connected to an attachment. When we desire something, we cling to the idea of possessing it. When we fear something, we cling to the idea of avoiding it. When we take pride in something, we cling to the idea that it makes us special. The merchant reflected on his life as a trader, on how every successful or failed negotiation had deeply affected his emotional state. He realized how much he had built his identity around his possessions and achievements. The master then picked up a small, beautifully decorated ceramic bowl and held it in his hands. "This bowl," he said, "is hundreds of years old. It has passed through countless hands before arriving here. One day, it will inevitably break. Knowing this, how should we relate to it?" Before the merchant could respond, the master let the bowl fall. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed through the room. The merchant felt a pang in his chest, even though the bowl wasn't his. "Notice your reaction," the master said. "The suffering does not come from the broken bowl, but from our attachment to the idea that it should remain whole forever." As they gathered the shards, the master continued, "Like this bowl, everything in our lives is temporary. Our possessions, our relationships, our achievements, even our emotions. Suffering arises when we cling to something that, by its very nature, cannot be permanent." The merchant recalled all the times he had suffered over lost goods, failed deals, and ended relationships. He began to understand how his attachment to specific outcomes had intensified his pain. "But master," he asked, "how can we live in the world without attaching ourselves to anything?" The master smiled and picked up the shards of the broken bowl. With delicate movements, he arranged them into a new pattern on the floor, creating a sort of mosaic. "Detachment does not mean indifference," he explained. "It means understanding the true nature of things and loving them precisely because they are impermanent. See how the broken pieces can create something new and equally beautiful." As the day progressed, the master and the merchant continued exploring the room, but now with a fresh perspective. Each object was no longer seen merely for its material value, but as a silent teacher about the nature of attachment and detachment. At the end of the day, the master led the merchant to the door of the room. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will learn how to turn everything you have discovered into a daily practice. But tonight, pay attention to your dreams and see how many of them are woven with the threads of attachment." The merchant left the room transformed, realizing that the true treasure was not in the objects we accumulate, but in the freedom we find when we learn to relate to them without attachment. The moon was high in the sky when he retired to rest, knowing that the following morning would bring a new level of understanding. The final day of teachings began even before the sun rose. The master woke the merchant and took him to the temple garden, where an elderly monk was sweeping fallen leaves with slow and precise movements. The garden was large, and every day new leaves would fall, making the task seemingly endless. "Observe," said the master. This monk has been sweeping the garden for 40 years. Every day, the leaves fall. Every day, he sweeps. He never complains, never gives up, never questions why he must continue when tomorrow there will be more leaves. The merchant watched the monk for hours. He noticed how every sweep of the broom was done with complete presence. There was no rush, no frustration, only the movement of the broom and the soft sound of leaves being gathered. Your emotions, the master explained, are like these leaves. Every day, new ones will arise. The practice is not to stop them from falling, but to develop the discipline to deal with them daily, with patience and awareness. Throughout that day, the master taught the merchant a daily routine. In the morning, before beginning his activities, he was to sit silently for a few moments, observing his breath and acknowledging his emotions. During the day, he was to create small pauses between one negotiation and another, between one thought and the next, to reconnect with his inner presence. True practice, said the master, does not happen only in special moments or sacred places. It happens in the market, during negotiations, in moments of joy, and in moments of difficulty. Every breath is an opportunity for practice. At midday, they shared a simple meal. The master taught how even the act of eating could become a practice of mindfulness. Every bite is a chance to be present. Every sip of water is an opportunity for gratitude. In the afternoon, the master took the merchant back to all the places they had visited in the previous days: the river, the market, and the room of objects. At each location, he revisited the lessons learned, but now with a new understanding. Every teaching was not separate, but part of an integrated practice. The recognition of emotions, the understanding of their transient nature, the space between stimulus and response, compassion and detachment, all of these must be practiced daily, like the monk sweeping the leaves. As the sun began to set on his final day at the temple, the master led the merchant to a high point on the mountain, where they could see the entire valley below. The lights of the houses began to flicker on, creating a tapestry of tiny glowing points. "Look at these lights," the master said. "Each one represents a life, a story, a journey. Just like you, every person down there is learning to deal with their own emotions, their own challenges. The practice you have learned here is not just for yourself. It is a gift you can share with everyone you meet." Before departing, the merchant asked the master what the most important message of all the teachings was. The master smiled and replied, "Mastery over emotions does not mean suppressing or denying them. It means understanding their nature, recognizing them with compassion, giving them space to flow and transform. Like the river that flows constantly, like the leaves that fall each day, our emotions are a natural part of life. True mastery is not about having no emotions, but about learning to dance with them, understanding that each emotion is a teacher, each challenge an opportunity for growth. Remember, recognition brings clarity, impermanence brings freedom, the space in between brings choice, compassion brings healing, detachment brings peace, and daily practice brings transformation. This is the sacred dance of emotional mastery, not a battle to be won, but an art to be cultivated day by day, moment by moment." The merchant returned to the city transformed. His business had not changed, but the way he approached it was entirely different. Each challenge became an opportunity for practice, each emotion a chance for growth. And so, day after day, like the monk sweeping the leaves, he continued his practice, sharing his wisdom with everyone he encountered along the way. And so this story ends, but like all great truths, its meaning continues to unfold, day by day, for all those who choose to practice the art of emotional mastery with patience, compassion, and dedication.